The automatic doors of Riverside Community Center slid open with a soft whoosh, and a woman in her early 40s stepped inside, carrying nothing but a small brown leather bag and a worn notebook. She wore simple jeans, a gray cardigan that had seen better days, and sneakers that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no makeup. Everything about her said ordinary. The lobby buzzed with activity. A yoga class was wrapping up in one room, while children's laughter echoed from an art workshop down the hall. But the woman walked past it all, following the signs that read Adult Beginner Piano, Room 3B. Her steps were quiet, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. When she pushed open the door to Room 3B, 7 other people were already there, clustered in small groups and chatting animatedly. Most of them looked to be in their 30s and 40s, though one elderly gentleman sat alone in the corner studying a book about music theory. The room itself was modest, with pale yellow walls decorated with faded posters of famous composers. 5 keyboards were set up on folding tables, and in the far corner sat an old upright piano that looked like it had survived several decades of enthusiastic students. Nobody looked up when she entered. She was grateful for that. The woman quietly made her way to the upright piano in the corner, set her bag down on the bench, and took a seat. The wood was scratched and worn smooth by countless hands, and several of the white keys had turned slightly yellow with age. She ran her fingers lightly over them without pressing down, feeling their familiar shape. "All right, everyone, let's get started." A cheerful voice cut through the chatter. The instructor, a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and an enthusiastic smile, clapped his hands together. He wore a button-down shirt with musical notes printed on it and khaki pants. "Welcome, welcome. I'm Robert Peterson, but please, just call me Rob. I've been teaching piano here at the community center for almost 15 years, and I have to say this is one of my favorite classes to teach." The students settled into their seats, and the woman at the upright piano folded her hands in her lap, listening quietly. "Now, I know some of you might be feeling a bit nervous," Rob continued, walking around the room with an easy confidence. "Maybe you're thinking you're too old to learn, or that you don't have any musical talent. Well, I'm here to tell you that's nonsense. Music is for everyone, and it's never too late to start. I've had students in their 70s play beautifully after just a year of practice." He stopped near the woman at the upright piano. "I see we have one more student. Welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself?" The woman looked up, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes, something deep and complicated. But then it was gone, replaced by a shy, slightly nervous smile. "My name is Helen," she said softly. Her voice was so quiet that the students on the other side of the room had to lean forward to hear. "I'm 42 and I work as an accountant downtown." "Wonderful, wonderful," Rob said warmly. "And do you have any musical background, Helen?" "I took a few lessons when I was a child," she replied, her eyes dropping to the keys. "Nothing serious. Just a year or two, but that was a long time ago. I barely remember anything." "That's perfectly fine," Rob assured her. "We'll start from the basics and it'll all come back to you." "Muscle memory is a powerful thing." Helen nodded but said nothing more. Rob moved on, asking each student to share their story. There was Jennifer, a nurse who'd always dreamed of playing piano but never had the time. There was Michael, a recently retired teacher who wanted to learn something new. There was Linda, a single mother whose daughter took piano lessons and she wanted to be able to help with practice. Each person had their reason, their little spark of hope that learning piano would add something meaningful to their lives. After introductions, Rob launched into the first lesson with infectious enthusiasm. He talked about posture, about how to sit at the piano with your back straight but not rigid, shoulders relaxed, feet flat on the floor. He demonstrated proper hand position, curving the fingers as if holding a small ball, keeping the wrists level with the forearm. Helen followed along, adjusting her posture and hand position as instructed. But if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed something odd. Her adjustments were too precise, too immediate. When Rob demonstrated the proper curve of the fingers, she didn't fumble or struggle to find the right shape. She simply placed her hands correctly as if her body already knew exactly what to do. But nobody was watching that closely. They were all too focused on their own struggles, trying to remember whether the thumb was finger number 1 or finger number 5, trying to keep their wrists from dropping or their fingers from collapsing at the joints. Rob moved around the room, gently correcting posture here, adjusting hand position there. When he reached Helen, he paused, studying her hands for a moment. "Very good," he said, sounding pleased. "You have a natural sense for hand position." "That's excellent." Helen smiled but didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the keys. The first actual notes came next. Rob taught them middle C, showed them where it was on the keyboard, explained the pattern of black and white keys. Then he had them play simple 5-finger scales, just moving from C to G and back down again. The room filled with hesitant, stuttering notes as students pecked at the keys, counting out loud, sometimes hitting 2 keys at once by accident. It was the sound of beginners, and it was perfectly normal. Helen played her scale slowly, carefully, as if concentrating hard on each note. She even missed the F once, hitting E instead, and had to start over. "Oops," she murmured to herself, so quietly only the elderly gentleman at the nearest keyboard could hear. But again, if someone had been paying very close attention, they might have noticed that her mistake looked deliberate. The way her finger moved to the wrong key was just slightly too controlled, too intentional. After an hour, Rob wrapped up the class with encouraging words and homework assignments. "Practice these scales every day, even if it's just for 10 minutes, he said. "Consistency is more important than long practice sessions. And don't worry about making mistakes. That's how we learn." As the other students packed up their things, chattering excitedly about the class and exchanging phone numbers to form a practice group, Helen quietly slipped her notebook into her bag. Jennifer approached her, smiling. "Would you like to join us for coffee? A few of us are going to the cafe next door." "Thank you, but I have to get back to work," Helen said apologetically. "Maybe another time." She was out the door before anyone could insist, disappearing into the busy hallway like a ghost. Behind her, the old upright piano sat silent in the corner, keeping whatever secrets it had learned. 3 weeks had passed since that first class, and Helen had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she would arrive at the community center exactly 5 minutes before class started, take her seat at the old upright piano in the corner, and blend into the background. She practiced her simple scales, played her beginner exercises, and spoke only when spoken to. The other students had grown close, forming friendships over shared struggles with finger coordination and reading sheet music. They texted each other practice videos, complained good-naturedly about sore fingers, and celebrated small victories like finally playing "Mary Had a Little Lamb" without looking at their hands. Helen remained polite but distant, always declining invitations to their group practice sessions or social gatherings. On this particular Thursday evening, Rob walked into the classroom with an energy that was different from usual. He was practically bouncing on his toes, his eyes bright with excitement. Behind him came a woman in her late 40s, tall and elegant, with short silver hair and an air of quiet authority. She wore a burgundy blazer and carried a leather portfolio under her arm. "Good evening, everyone," Rob announced, unable to contain his grin. "I have fantastic news to share with you all tonight. But first, let me introduce someone. This is Catherine Davidson. She's a classically trained pianist who's recently moved to our area, and she's generously agreed to volunteer as a co-instructor for our program." Catherine smiled and gave a small wave. "Please, just call me Kathy. I'm excited to be here and to work with all of you." The students offered enthusiastic applause, and Kathy took a seat near one of the keyboards, setting her portfolio down with practiced care. Helen, sitting at her usual spot in the corner, watched the new instructor with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Now, for the exciting news," Rob continued, clasping his hands together. "As many of you know, every spring the Riverside Community Center hosts an arts festival. It's a wonderful celebration of all the creative activities that happen here throughout the year. There's visual art, dance performances, theater, poetry readings, and of course music." Jennifer raised her hand eagerly. "Are we going to get to watch the performances?" "Better than that," Rob said, his smile widening. "We're going to be in the performances. I've secured a spot for our class to play at the festival. It'll be on the first Saturday of April, just 5 weeks from now." The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some students looked thrilled, others appeared terrified. Michael, the retired teacher, let out a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right? We've only been playing for 3 weeks." "I know it seems daunting," Rob said reassuringly, But trust me, 5 weeks is plenty of time. I'm going to assign each of you a piece that's perfectly suited to your current skill level. Nothing too challenging. Nothing that will make you uncomfortable. This is meant to be fun, a way to celebrate your progress and share your joy of music with the community. Linda, the single mother, looked worried. How many people usually come to this festival? Oh, it varies, Rob said casually. Last year we had about 200 people throughout the day. But don't think of it as performing for a crowd. Think of it as sharing something beautiful with friends. 200 people. Helen's fingers resting lightly on the piano keys, pressed down just slightly, not enough to make a sound, but enough to feel the resistance of the keys beneath her fingertips. Over the next hour, Rob went around the room assigning pieces to each student. For Jennifer, he chose a simplified version of Amazing Grace. For Michael, When the Saints Go Marching In. For Linda, a gentle arrangement of Greensleeves. Each piece was carefully selected to match the student's progress and comfort level. When he reached Helen, he barely hesitated. For you, Helen, I think we'll go with Ode to Joy. It's a beautiful piece, recognizable, and the arrangement I have in mind is very manageable. Mostly single notes, steady rhythm. You'll do wonderfully with it. That sounds perfect, Helen said softly, accepting the sheet music he handed her. Thank you. Wonderful, Rob said, moving on to the next student. But Kathy, the new co-instructor, had been watching Helen throughout the class. She'd noticed things that Rob, in his enthusiastic teaching style, had perhaps overlooked. The way Helen's fingers naturally curved over the keys even when she wasn't playing, the way her wrists stayed perfectly level without any conscious adjustment, the way she read sheet music with quick darting glances rather than the slow, careful study of a true beginner. After class ended and the students began packing up their things, Kathy approached Helen's corner. The other students were clustered near the door, already discussing their assigned pieces and making plans to practice together. Helen, is it? Kathy said pleasantly. Helen looked up from putting her sheet music into her bag. Yes, it's nice to meet you officially. You too, Kathy said, leaning casually against the upright piano. I was watching you play during class today. You have remarkably good hand position for someone who's only been back at the piano for a few weeks. Oh, Helen said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Well, Rob is a good teacher. He explains things clearly. He is, Kathy agreed. But there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and having it in your muscle memory. Your hand position isn't just good, it's instinctive. Natural. Helen's fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her bag. I suppose some things stay with you even after years away. Kathy said thoughtfully. How many lessons did you say you took as a child? A year or two, Helen replied, her voice remaining steady. Nothing extensive. Kathy nodded slowly, but her eyes said she wasn't entirely convinced. Well, if you ever want any extra help preparing for the festival, please let me know. I'm here on Mondays and Wednesdays too, working with some of the intermediate students. I appreciate that, Helen said, but I think I'll be fine with Ode to Joy. It's well within my abilities. There was something in the way she said within my abilities that made Kathy's eyebrows rise slightly. But before she could respond, Helen had already shouldered her bag and was heading toward the door with that same quiet, unhurried walk. That evening, after all the students had left, Kathy found Rob in his small office, organizing sheet music for the upcoming festival performances. Rob, can I ask you something about Helen? Kathy said, leaning against the doorframe. Sure, Rob said, looking up from his filing. She's a good student, isn't she? Very dedicated, never misses a class. She is, Kathy agreed. But I'm wondering if maybe she's more advanced than she's letting on. Some of the things I'm seeing don't quite add up for someone at her supposed skill level. Rob chuckled and shook his head. Kathy, I appreciate your observational skills, but I think you might be reading too much into it. Helen's a beginner, just like the others. She's careful and methodical, which makes her look polished, but she's definitely still learning. You should have seen her the first week. She could barely play a scale without hesitating. Maybe, Kathy said, but she didn't sound convinced. It's just that I've been teaching piano for 25 years, and there's something about the way she moves her hands, the way she positions her body at the piano. It's too refined, too automatic. Well, even if she had more training than she remembers, what does it matter? Rob said reasonably. She's here to learn, she's engaged with the material, and she's not causing any problems. Let's just let her progress at her own pace. Kathy nodded slowly, but as she left Rob's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that Helen was hiding something significant. And more importantly, she couldn't understand why someone would deliberately pretend to be less skilled than they actually were. The question nagged at her all the way home, and continued to nag at her over the following days. She found herself watching Helen more closely during the next few classes, cataloging every small detail that seemed out of place. The way Helen's fingers never collapsed at the joints even when playing slowly. The way she never looked tense or uncertain, even when attempting something new. The way her rhythm was always perfect, even when she claimed to be struggling with timing. By the second week after the festival announcement, Kathy had become convinced that Helen wasn't just a beginner with good instincts. She was someone with serious training, possibly even professional-level training, who was deliberately playing beneath her abilities. But the question remained, why would someone do that? What was Helen hiding, and more importantly, what was she hiding from? 2 weeks before the festival, everything changed. Helen arrived at class as usual, 5 minutes early, carrying her worn notebook and the sheet music for Ode to Joy that she'd been practicing. But when she walked into room 3B, she immediately sensed something was different. The energy in the room felt heavier, more serious. Rob and Kathy were standing together near the front, speaking in low, urgent voices. 3 other instructors from the community center were there too, people Helen had seen in the hallways but never spoken to. They all looked stressed. The other students filtered in, exchanging confused glances. This wasn't normal. Once everyone was seated, Rob cleared his throat. His usual cheerful demeanor was strained, and there were tired lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation with the festival, and I need to be honest with you about it." The room went silent. Even the elderly gentleman who usually hummed while he practiced sat perfectly still, waiting. One of our advanced students, the one who was supposed to perform the centerpiece of our music program, has had to withdraw from the festival. Family emergency, she had to move out of state quite suddenly. Rob paused, rubbing the back of his neck. The problem is she was scheduled to play some of the more challenging classical pieces. Without her, our program is going to be, well, a bit thin on the more impressive performances. Kathy stepped forward, her expression serious but determined. What Rob is trying to say is that we need someone who can step up and play something more advanced. Something that will showcase the real depth and beauty of piano music. Helen felt her stomach tighten. She kept her eyes fixed on her sheet music, suddenly very interested in the notes of Ode to Joy. "Now I know this is asking a lot," Rob continued, "and I don't want anyone to feel pressured. But if any of you have more experience than you've let on, or if any of you feel capable of learning something more challenging in the next 2 weeks, please consider it. We really need help here." The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jennifer laughed nervously. "Rob, I can barely play Amazing Grace without looking at my hands." "I don't think I'm your person." "Same here," Michael added. "I'm still mixing up my left and right hands half the time." One by one, the students expressed their limitations. And they were being honest. They were beginners, genuinely at the skill level they appeared to be. None of them could possibly learn an advanced piece in 2 weeks except one. Kathy's eyes had been on Helen the entire time, and now she walked slowly across the room, her footsteps deliberate until she stood directly in front of the old upright piano. "Helen," Kathy said quietly, "could I speak with you after class?" "Of course," Helen replied, her voice steady but her hands gripping the edge of her notebook a little too tightly. The rest of the class passed in a blur of distracted practice. The students went through their assigned pieces, but everyone's mind was on the festival problem. Rob tried to maintain his encouraging attitude, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. When class finally ended and the other students left, Helen remained seated at the upright piano. Rob, Kathy, and 2 of the other instructors approached her. Their faces were kind but determined. "Helen," Kathy began, sitting down on the bench beside her, "I'm going to be direct with you because we're running out of time. I don't think you're a beginner. I've been teaching piano for 25 years, and I know what genuine beginners look like. You're not one of them." Helen's face remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. "I appreciate your confidence in me, but I really am just relearning. I haven't played seriously in decades." "Then play something for us," Kathy said gently. "Not your assigned piece. Something from memory, anything you remember from when you were younger." I don't think that's a good idea, Helen said softly. Rob knelt down beside the piano bench, his expression pleading. Helen, I'm not trying to pressure you, but we're in a real bind here. The festival is in 2 weeks. The mayor is coming. The local news is covering it. We promised the community a quality music program, and right now we're going to fall short. If you have any ability at all to help us, we really need you. Helen looked at the 3 faces staring at her with desperate hope. She felt trapped, cornered in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her throat tightened. I can't, she whispered. Please don't ask me to do this. But they didn't understand. They couldn't see the panic rising in her chest, couldn't feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. We're just asking you to try, one of the other instructors said, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who taught the intermediate classes. We have a beautiful piece in mind. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It's challenging, yes, but it's also deeply moving. If you could even attempt it, it would save our program. Rachmaninoff. Helen's hands went cold. Of course they would choose that piece. It was famous, dramatic, the kind of performance that would impress an audience. And it was also a piece that required not just technical skill, but emotional depth, the kind of playing that came from the soul. I really can't, Helen said again, her voice firmer now. You're mistaken about me. I'm not who you think I am. Over the next week, the pressure only intensified. It started with gentle suggestions during class. Helen, why don't you try playing this section, just to see how it feels? Then came the phone calls. Kathy called her Tuesday evening, then again on Thursday. Rob left her a voicemail on Saturday morning, his voice apologetic but insistent. On Monday, Helen arrived at the community center for what she thought would be a regular class, only to find Rob, Kathy, and 4 other staff members waiting for her in room 3B. No other students. Just her and a group of increasingly desperate instructors. This isn't fair, Helen said, standing in the doorway, her hand still on the handle. She felt ambushed, betrayed. We know, Rob said, and he genuinely looked sorry. We know this isn't fair, and we know we're putting you in an uncomfortable position. But Helen, we've been watching you for weeks now. The way you move, the way you read music, the way your fingers naturally find the right position. You're not a beginner. You might have been away from the piano for a while, but you have serious training. We can see it. And we wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate, Patricia added. We've called every pianist in the area. Everyone who's qualified is already booked for that weekend. Or they're asking for performance fees we simply can't afford. You're our only option. Kathy stood up and walked toward Helen slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. I know you're scared, she said softly. Stage fright is real and it's nothing to be ashamed of. But sometimes we have to push through our fears to help others. The community center has given so much to this neighborhood. Don't you think we owe it to them to put on the best show we can? Helen felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. They didn't understand. They thought this was about stage fright, about performance anxiety, about simple nervousness. They had no idea what they were really asking her to do. If I do this, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, if I play for your festival, will you promise to leave me alone afterward? Will you let me go back to being just another student in the beginner class? The instructors exchanged glances. They were confused by her request, but they were also desperate enough to agree to almost anything. Of course, Rob said quickly. Whatever you want, Helen, just please help us out here. Helen closed her eyes for a long moment. She thought about the past 5 years, the careful anonymity she'd built, the peace she'd finally found in obscurity. And then she thought about these kind people who'd welcomed her into their class, who'd given her a space to remember why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. I won't play the Rachmaninoff, she said finally, opening her eyes, but I'll play something. One piece, one performance, and then this conversation never happens again. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. Rob actually put his hand over his heart, and Patricia looked like she might cry. Thank you, Kathy breathed. Thank you so much, Helen. You have no idea what this means to us. But as Helen walked toward the grand piano that had been brought in specifically for the festival, she thought grimly that they had no idea what this meant to her either. They were about to find out exactly who she was. And once they knew, everything would change. She sat down at the bench, her hands hovering over the keys for just a moment. Then she took a deep breath and began to play, The grand piano sat in the middle of room 3B like a sleeping giant. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that the community center had rented specifically for the festival. Its black lacquer surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and even from across the room, Helen could see her reflection in its polished surface. She walked toward it slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Rob, Kathy, Patricia, and the other instructors stood back, giving her space. They sensed that something important was about to happen, though they couldn't have known exactly what. Helen reached the piano and stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Her fingers trembled slightly at her sides. Then, with the careful movements of someone performing a sacred ritual, she sat down on the bench and adjusted its height with the lever underneath. She positioned herself at the exact center of the keyboard, her back straight, her feet flat on the floor. "I'm not going to play the Rachmaninoff," she said quietly, not looking at the instructors behind her. "I'm going to play something else." "That's fine," Rob said quickly. "Whatever you're comfortable with." Helen's hands hovered over the keys. The grand piano was a completely different instrument from the old upright she'd been playing. The keys were more responsive, the action smoother, the sound richer and more resonant. It was like the difference between walking and flying. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths the way she'd been taught decades ago. Center yourself. Find the music in the silence. Let everything else fall away. And then her fingers touched the keys. The first notes of Liszt's La Campanella rang out through the room, clear and bright as bells. It was one of the most technically difficult pieces in the entire piano repertoire, a showpiece designed to demonstrate the absolute limits of human capability at the keyboard. Most professional pianists spent months preparing it, and even then, many refused to perform it publicly because of its notorious difficulty. Helen played it as if she were breathing. Her fingers flew across the keys in impossible patterns, executing massive leaps from one end of the keyboard to the other with perfect accuracy. The melody danced and sparkled, alternating between delicate bell-like tones and thundering octaves that made the floor vibrate. Her right hand executed rapid, repeated notes that would have exhausted most players within seconds, while her left hand provided a rich harmonic foundation that seemed to come from a completely different instrument. Rob's mouth fell open. Kathy took an involuntary step backward. Patricia grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. The music filled every corner of the room, spilling out into the hallway where 2 janitors stopped their work to listen, drawn by sounds they'd never expected to hear in a community center. A yoga instructor passing by froze in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. Helen's face was completely serene. Her eyes remained closed and there was no strain visible in her body despite the incredible physical demands of the piece. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her wrists fluid. She wasn't fighting the piano or forcing the music. She was simply letting it flow through her, as natural as a river finding its path to the sea. The piece built to its climactic ending, the notes cascading faster and faster until they seemed to blur together into pure sound, and then with a final flourish that sent her hands flying to opposite ends of the keyboard, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Helen's hands remained suspended in the air for a moment, then slowly lowered to rest in her lap. She opened her eyes and stared at the keys, not turning around to face the instructors behind her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The magnitude of what they'd just witnessed had rendered them all temporarily speechless. Finally, Kathy found her voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" Helen's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. Then slowly she turned around on the bench to face them. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her face held an expression of profound exhaustion, mixed with something that might have been relief. "My name is Helen Chen," she said quietly. "And I'm a concert pianist. Or at least I was." Rob shook his head slowly as if trying to clear it. "I don't understand." "You said you were an accountant." "I am an accountant," Helen replied. "Now, for the past 5 years, that's exactly what I've been. But before that, I spent 27 years as a professional musician. I started playing when I was 4 years old. I gave my first public recital at 6. By the time I was 16, I was touring internationally. I'd won competitions in Moscow, Vienna, London, New York. The words hung in the air like confessions. Patricia slowly sank into one of the student chairs, her legs no longer able to support her. "I performed at Carnegie Hall 17 times, Helen continued, her voice growing stronger now that the truth was finally coming out. "I recorded 8 albums. I played for presidents and prime ministers and royalty. I was reviewed by every major classical music publication in the world. For most of my adult life, I was never just Helen. I was Dr. Helen Chen, the piano virtuoso, the prodigy who never stopped being a prodigy, even when I grew up. Kathy moved closer, her professional composure cracking. But why are you here? Why pretend to be a beginner? Helen looked down at her hands, those hands that had been trained since childhood to do impossible things. Because I broke, she said simply. 5 years ago, right in the middle of a performance at the Sydney Opera House, I just stopped playing. I was halfway through Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, one of the hardest pieces ever written, and I suddenly couldn't remember why I was there. I couldn't remember the last time I'd played something just because I wanted to, not because it was scheduled or expected or required. She stood up from the bench and walked a few steps away from the piano, wrapping her arms around herself. The pressure never stopped. Every performance had to be perfect. Every recording had to be better than the last. Every competition, every review, every social media post dissecting my technique or my interpretation or what I was wearing. I lived in hotels. I practiced 8 hours a day. I had panic attacks before every concert, and everyone around me kept saying it was normal, that this was the price of excellence, that I should be grateful for the opportunity. Rob's expression had shifted from shock to something like horror. Helen, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Of course you didn't, Helen said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only weariness. That was the whole point. 5 years ago, I walked off that stage in Sydney, told my agent I was done, and disappeared. I changed my name slightly, moved across the country, and started a completely new life. I wanted to be ordinary. I wanted to go to work and come home and not have every moment of my day scheduled around music. She turned back to face them, and now the tears were visible on her cheeks. But I still missed it. I missed playing. Not performing, not competing, not proving myself. Just playing. Making music for the simple joy of it. So I found this class, this beginner class, where nobody would know who I was or what I could do, where I could make mistakes without being judged, where I could play Ode to Joy slowly and carefully and find beauty in its simplicity. The room had gone completely silent again. Even the sounds from the hallway had faded away. I just wanted to be a normal student, Helen said, her voice breaking slightly. I wanted to remember what it felt like to love music without the weight of expectations crushing me. And for 3 weeks I had that. It was the most peaceful 3 weeks I'd had in 30 years. Kathy walked over to Helen and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. We took that from you, she said softly. We did exactly what you were running from. We put pressure on you. We made demands. We wouldn't take no for an answer. Helen wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. You didn't know. That's not an excuse, Rob said, and his voice was thick with emotion. You told us no. Multiple times. We should have respected that. Instead, we badgered you and cornered you and made you feel like you had no choice. Patricia stood up from her chair, her own eyes red. We're supposed to be teachers. We're supposed to create safe spaces for people to learn and grow, and instead, we ambushed you and manipulated you into revealing something you clearly wanted to keep private. Helen shook her head. It's not just your fault. I should have been honest from the beginning. I should have told you that I needed this class to be a safe space, that I was dealing with something complicated, but I was afraid that if anyone knew, they'd treat me differently. And I was right to be afraid, wasn't I? The truth of that statement settled over all of them like a heavy blanket. Everything had changed the moment they'd seen what Helen could really do. She wasn't just another student anymore. She was Dr. Helen Chen, the virtuoso, the prodigy, the woman who could play impossible music with ease. They would never be able to see her as simply Helen again. The morning of the Spring Arts Festival arrived with perfect weather. Bright sunshine, a gentle breeze, and the kind of warmth that made people want to spend the day outside. The community center's lawn had been transformed with white tents, food vendors, and rows of folding chairs facing a small outdoor stage. Helen arrived early, before most of the crowd. She wore a simple navy blue dress and carried her worn notebook, the same one she'd brought to every class. Her hair was pulled back in her usual practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than an ordinary woman, preparing to play in a small community recital. Backstage, which was really just a cordoned-off area behind the stage with a few folding tables and chairs, the beginner piano students were gathered in various states of nervousness. Jennifer kept flexing her fingers. Michael was quietly running through his piece on a practice keyboard with the volume turned down. Linda looked pale but determined. When Helen walked in, they all turned to look at her. And she froze, waiting for everything to change, waiting for them to see her differently now that they knew who she really was. But Jennifer just smiled and waved. "Helen, thank goodness you're here. I'm so nervous I can barely remember my own name." Michael laughed. "Join the club. I've played When the Saints Go Marching In 1,000 times, and suddenly I can't remember if it starts on C or F." They didn't know. Rob and Kathy hadn't told them. Helen felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. Rob appeared from around the corner carrying a clipboard and looking harried but happy. When he saw Helen, he walked over quickly. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked quietly. They stepped away from the group, finding a quiet spot near the back of the tent. Rob looked at her with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and earnest. "I talked to Kathy and the others," he said. "We all agreed. We're not putting you in the program as an advanced performer. You're going to play exactly what we originally assigned you. Ode to Joy, simple arrangement right along with all the other beginner students." Helen stared at him. "But what about the centerpiece performance? What about the Rachmaninoff?" "We called in a favor," Rob explained. "There's a high school senior, a really talented kid who's been studying piano for years. He agreed to step in and play for us. It's all taken care of." "But you were so desperate," Helen said, confused. "You said you needed me." Rob shook his head, and there was real regret in his eyes. "We were wrong. What we needed was to respect your boundaries and honor what you were asking for. And we failed at that spectacularly, so now we're trying to make it right." Before Helen could respond, Kathy appeared, along with Patricia and the other instructors who'd been there that day. They formed a small circle around her, their faces serious. "We owe you an apology," Kathy said. "A real one, not just words. What we did was unprofessional and unkind. We put our needs above yours, and we completely disregarded your very clear boundaries." Patricia nodded. "We're teachers. We're supposed to create environments where students feel safe to learn and grow. Instead, we made you feel cornered and exposed. That's the opposite of what we should have been doing. We can't take back what happened," Rob added, "but we can promise you that from this moment forward, you're just another student in the beginner class. Unless you tell us otherwise, no one will know what we saw. Your secret is safe with us." Helen felt tears prickling at her eyes again, but this time they were different tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The festival began at 10 in the morning, and by noon, the lawn was filled with nearly 300 people. Families spread out on blankets. Children ran between the tents, and the smell of grilled food drifted through the air. It was exactly the kind of warm community event that made neighborhoods feel like home. The beginner piano students performed in the early afternoon, taking turns at an upright piano that had been rolled onto the stage. Each one played their assigned piece, and each one received enthusiastic applause regardless of whether they hit every note perfectly or stumbled through a few measures. When it was Helen's turn, she walked onto the stage with the same quiet, unhurried steps she always used. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys, and then she played Ode to Joy exactly as a beginner would play it. Slowly, carefully, with full concentration on each note, she didn't add any flourishes or show off her technique. She didn't play with the sophisticated interpretation that her years of training had given her. She simply played the melody as it was written on the sheet music Rob had given her weeks ago, finding beauty in its straightforward simplicity. The audience clapped warmly when she finished, the same applause they'd given every other student. Helen stood, gave a small bow, and walked off stage. And as she returned to her seat among her fellow beginners, she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years, pure, uncomplicated joy. But Helen wasn't quite finished. After all the beginner students had performed and returned to their seats in the audience, and after the high school senior had played a beautiful rendition of Rachmaninoff that drew a standing ovation, the program was supposed to end. But Rob walked back onto the stage holding a microphone. "Before we close today's musical performances, we have one more announcement," he said, his voice carrying across the lawn. "Here at the Riverside Community Center, we believe that music should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their background or financial situation. And we're excited to announce a new program starting next month." He paused, looking directly at Helen in the audience. "We'll be offering free masterclasses for any student who wants to deepen their musical education. These classes will be taught by an incredibly talented instructor who believes, as we do, that learning should be joyful and pressure-free, focused on the love of music rather than competition or perfection. Helen stood up slowly, making her way back toward the stage as Rob continued. Our new instructor has graciously agreed to share her knowledge and experience with our community, with only one condition: that every student who comes to her classes is there because they want to be, not because they feel they have to be. Helen took the microphone from Rob, and for a moment she just stood there, looking out at the crowd of strangers who had no idea who she was or what she'd done in her previous life, and that anonymity felt like the greatest gift she'd ever received. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice steady. "Music has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started playing in the first place. I forgot that music isn't about being perfect or impressing people. It's about expression, connection, and joy." She looked back at her fellow beginner students, at Jennifer and Michael and Linda and all the others who'd welcomed her into their group without any expectations or demands. "These past few weeks, learning alongside all of you, have reminded me what music is supposed to feel like. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. So these master classes aren't just me teaching you. They're a way for us to learn together, to explore music in a space where mistakes are welcomed and growth happens at its own pace." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and Helen smiled as she handed the microphone back to Rob. As she walked off the stage for the final time that day, Kathy met her at the bottom of the steps. "Are you sure about this?" Kathy asked quietly. "Teaching classes means people will eventually figure out who you really are." Helen considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think so."
Not if we do it right.
"I won't be performing. I won't be competing. I'll just be a teacher, helping people discover something beautiful. That's different from being a concert pianist. That's something I can live with." "And if someone does recognize you?" Patricia asked, joining them. Helen smiled, and it was the first truly relaxed smile any of them had seen on her face. "Then I'll deal with it. But I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm not going to pretend to be less than I am. But I'm also not going to let what I can do define everything about who I am. There's a balance somewhere between those two extremes. And I'm finally ready to find it." As the festival continued around them and the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Helen sat on the grass with her beginner classmates, eating ice cream and laughing at Michael's terrible jokes. Somewhere in her past was Dr. Helen Chen, the virtuoso with all her awards and recordings and international acclaim. And somewhere in her future was Helen the teacher, sharing her gift with others in a way that brought joy instead of pressure. But in that moment, she was simply Helen, a woman who loved music and had finally found her way back to playing it on her own terms. And that, she thought as Jennifer accidentally spilled ice cream on her dress and they all burst out laughing, was more than enough.